My mother rolled her eyes the second I walked into that courtroom. The gesture lasted half a second, but it told me everything I needed to know. Elaine Monroe thought this was already over. She leaned toward my father, whispered something that made them both smirk like they were watching a child throw a tantrum. They had no idea what I was about to unleash. 10 years ago, I'd left their house with nothing but a backpack and my father's final words, "You'll never be anything without us." Now I was standing across from them as the woman they'd tried to destroy, holding evidence that would strip away everything they'd built their lives on. My parents had walked into this Alabama courthouse like they owned it, like the broken girl they'd discarded was still 17 and powerless. That was their first mistake. Their second was underestimating the woman who'd raised me after they threw me away. My grandmother, Judge Evelyn Carter, hadn't just left me money. She'd left me the truth about who Richard and Elaine Monroe really were. Where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story has traveled. The heavy oak doors closed behind me with a sound that seemed to echo through my chest. November wind had followed me inside, carrying the scent of dead leaves and rain. I smoothed my black blazer and took inventory of the room that would decide my future. 43 people had gathered to witness the Monroe family tear itself apart in public. They filled the wooden pews like Sunday congregation, some leaning forward with eager anticipation, others settling back with the resigned patience of people who'd seen too many family feuds play out in Mason Creek's small courthouse. My parents sat in the front row, and from behind, they looked exactly like what they'd always pretended to be. Richard Monroe, 72, silver-haired and straight-backed in his Navy suit. 40 years of practicing law had taught him how to project authority even in rooms where everyone knew his reputation. Beside him, Elaine had arranged herself with the precise elegance of a woman who'd spent 30 years selling houses to people who couldn't quite afford them. Her blonde hair caught the fluorescent light, and her pearl earrings matched the strand at her throat. Picture perfect. Respectable. The kind of couple who hosted charity dinners and smiled for the Mason Creek Herald Society page. But I knew what lived behind those smiles. The last time I'd seen them, I was 17, sitting in the back of Tommy Hartwell's rusted pickup truck with everything I owned crammed into a backpack. The engine had been running, exhaust visible in the February cold, while my father stood on our front porch delivering his final verdict. "You'll never be anything without us, Claire. You'll come crawling back, and when you do, don't expect us to answer the door." I'd believed him for exactly 3 years. Then I'd stopped waiting for their love and started building a life they couldn't touch. The bailiff called the room to order, and I watched my mother's shoulders tense. She'd probably spent the morning rehearsing her performance, practicing the wounded expressions and carefully calculated tears that had worked so well throughout my childhood. My father would be different, calm, measured, using the same voice he'd perfected for closing arguments and family dinners where he explained why I'd disappointed them again. They'd probably told their friends this was about money. Greedy daughter returns for inheritance. Family tragedy. Such a shame how children turn out these days. But the weight of the briefcase in my hand told a different story. Judge Harrison took his seat, and the room settled into the particular kind of silence that comes before important words are spoken. My parents had insisted on being here early, claiming the front row like territory. They wanted everyone to see them, the grieving son-in-law and daughter, forced to protect their mother's memory from a manipulative child. What they didn't know was that I'd been planning for this moment longer than they could imagine. I'd spent 10 years becoming someone they couldn't recognize. The scared teenager who'd climbed into that pickup truck had grown into a woman who understood exactly how to use the law they'd taught me to respect. More importantly, I'd learned something about family that they'd never wanted me to discover. My grandmother, Judge Evelyn Carter, had left me more than money. She'd left me the truth. Now, a decade later, I was standing across from them in court, not as a victim, but as the woman they tried to destroy. But they had no idea what I was about to reveal. The bailiff's voice cut through the silence. Case number 2024, PR 156, Monroe vs. Monroe, regarding the estate of Judge Evelyn Carter. My mother's fingers tightened on her purse. My father straightened his tie. And I smiled for the first time since walking through those doors. Have you ever had family turn their back on you? Let me know in the comments, because this gets so much deeper. The lawyer my parents had hired looked exactly like the kind of man Richard Monroe would choose: expensive suit, Princeton ring, the sort of practiced confidence that came from never losing cases that mattered. He shuffled through documents with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, probably dozens of times. Family inheritance disputes were bread and butter work for guys like Thomas Whitman. "Your Honor," Whitman began, his voice carrying the particular cadence lawyers used when they wanted to sound both respectful and certain. "My clients are here today because they believe Mrs. Carter's final will was executed under circumstances that raise serious concerns about undue influence." I watched my father nod slowly, playing the role of concerned son-in-law forced into an uncomfortable position. My mother had already arranged her expression into something that suggested dignified grief mixed with reluctant determination. They'd rehearsed this performance. But while Whitman spoke about mental capacity and family estrangement, my mind traveled back to a different courtroom. 20 years earlier, when I was 8 years old and small enough to hide behind the gallery pews while my grandmother worked. Judge Evelyn Carter had never looked small behind her bench. Even at 75, she'd commanded that courtroom with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent 4 decades making decisions that mattered. I used to watch her during summer visits, sitting in the back row with a coloring book, listening to her handle custody disputes and property cases with a combination of wisdom and steel that made grown men straighten their shoulders when she spoke. "The law isn't about what people deserve," she'd told me once, driving home from the courthouse in her old Crown Victoria. "It's about what they've earned through their choices." The farmhouse she'd left me sat on 47 acres outside Mason Creek, white clapboard and wraparound porches that had hosted 3 generations of family gatherings. But the real legacy was the Carter Foundation, scholarship money that had sent 23 local kids to college over the past 15 years. Kids whose parents cleaned offices and stocked shelves, kids who wouldn't have had any other chance. My parents had visited that farmhouse exactly 6 times in the last decade. I knew because my grandmother kept a guest book, and I'd checked it after the funeral. 6 visits, usually during holidays when their absence would have been noticed by people who mattered. They'd stay for dinner, make conversation about Richard's practice and Elaine's latest real estate successes, then drive back to town where they could complain privately about the old woman's stubborn independence. I'd visited 47 times. Not because I was trying to curry favor or position myself for an inheritance I'd never expected. I'd visited because Sunday dinners at Grandma Evelyn's table were the only place in the world where someone asked about my life and actually listened to the answers. Mrs. Monroe was estranged from her granddaughter for several years, Whitman continued, gesturing toward me without quite looking in my direction. During that time, Miss Claire Monroe made no effort to maintain contact with the family or contribute to Mrs. Carter's care during her declining health. The lies came so smoothly I almost admired the craftsmanship. They'd probably convinced themselves this version was true by now. In their telling, I was the one who'd cut ties. I was the ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned family responsibility and returned only when money was involved. But the people of Mason Creek had longer memories than my parents realized. I could see it in the faces around me, the postmaster who'd delivered my weekly letters to my grandmother for 10 years, the grocery store owner who'd seen me loading supplies for her monthly food deliveries, the church secretary who'd watched me sit beside her hospital bed every day during her final illness. Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop caught my eye and offered a small nod. She'd arranged the yellow roses I'd brought to every visit because my grandmother loved yellow roses and my parents had never bothered to learn that simple fact. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that looked suspiciously dry. Furthermore, Whitman said, warming to his theme, the defendant's sudden reappearance and the timing of this will's execution raise questions about whether Mrs. Carter was acting of her own free will. What no one knew was that my grandmother left me something far more powerful than money. Judge Harrison listened with the patient expression of someone who'd heard variations of this story before. Family members fighting over estates, children claiming parents had been manipulated, lawyers arguing about mental capacity and undue influence. He probably figured this was just another sad case of relatives getting greedy after a funeral. The trial was about to begin, but I had evidence that would destroy everything they thought they knew about our family. YouTube's algorithm buries stories like this because they're too controversial for family-friendly content. If you want to keep hearing real stories about real family trauma, you have to actively choose it. Subscribe before this gets hidden. The argument that ended my childhood started over a college application. I'd been accepted to Auburn with partial scholarship money, not enough to cover everything, but enough to make it possible if we were careful. I'd worked at Henderson's Hardware for 2 summers, saving every dollar I could spare, and the guidance counselor had helped me apply for additional grants. It wasn't perfect, but it was a path forward. Absolutely not, my father had said, not looking up from his dinner plate. You're not mature enough for college, Claire. Look at your grades this semester. My grades had dropped because I'd been working 30 hours a week to save money for the tuition they'd refused to help with. The irony wasn't lost on me, but pointing that out would only make things worse. Richard's right, my mother added, cutting her chicken with precise movements. Besides, there are plenty of opportunities right here in Mason Creek. You could work at the real estate office, learn the business from the ground up. Working at Elaine Monroe's real estate office meant answering phones and filing papers while she took credit for any sales I might generate. It meant staying in their house under their rules indefinitely. It meant never becoming anything they couldn't control. I've already been accepted, I'd said quietly. The scholarship covers most of it. My father's fork had stopped halfway to his mouth. Most of it isn't all of it. You expect us to throw away money on some fantasy about you becoming something you're not. The conversation had gone downhill from there. By the time the plates were cleared, they'd made their position clear. College was a waste of money for someone like me. I was impulsive, irresponsible, and ungrateful for everything they'd already provided. If I wanted to throw my life away chasing unrealistic dreams, I could do it without their support. That night, I'd called my grandmother from the kitchen phone, whispering so my parents wouldn't hear from upstairs. They won't help with college, I'd told her, trying not to cry. They want me to work for Mom and stay here forever. Oh, sweetheart. Her voice had carried the warmth that was missing from every other conversation in that house. What do you want to do? It was such a simple question, but nobody had ever asked it before. What did I want? Not what my parents expected, or what would make them happy, or what would avoid another argument. What did Claire want? I want to leave, I'd whispered. I want to go to college and study something that matters and never come back. Then that's what you should do. 3 days later, Tommy Hartwell's pickup truck had been idling in our driveway at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night. I'd waited until my parents' bedroom light went out, then slipped downstairs with my backpack and the duffel bag I'd hidden under my bed. 2 years' worth of clothes, the college acceptance letter, and every dollar I'd saved from Henderson's Hardware. My father had heard the truck's engine. He'd appeared on the front porch in his robe and slippers, his face twisted with the kind of rage he usually saved for closing arguments. You walk out that door, Claire, and you're on your own, he'd called across the dark lawn. Don't come crawling back when reality hits. You'll never be anything without us. I'd climbed into Tommy's truck anyway, backpack clutched against my chest like armor. My hands had been shaking so badly I couldn't fasten the seatbelt. But before Tommy could put the truck in gear, my grandmother's Crown Victoria had pulled up behind us. She'd gotten out wearing her winter coat over her nightgown, her gray hair caught up in the curlers she wore to bed. Wait just a minute, she'd told Tommy, then walked to my side of the truck. Through the open window, she'd pressed something into my palm, what I'd thought was just folded bills for gas money. You call me when you get settled, she'd said. And Claire? Your grandfather would be proud of you tonight. My parents had watched from the porch as we drove away. My mother's face had been stone cold, but my father's expression had been something closer to satisfaction. They'd gotten what they wanted, a daughter who'd finally proven she was exactly as selfish and ungrateful as they'd always claimed. I remember thinking I'd never be strong enough to face them again. But Grandma taught me something about strength that took me 10 years to understand. What she'd pressed into my hand that night hadn't just been gas money. When I'd finally unfolded it in my dorm room 3 hours later, I'd found $200 in 20s wrapped around a handwritten note. Love isn't what people say, sweetheart. It's what they do when nobody's watching. Call me tomorrow. She'd helped me apply for additional grants, sent care packages during exam weeks, and attended my graduation when my parents couldn't be bothered to make the drive. She'd never once suggested I should forgive them or try to repair what they'd broken. Instead, she'd shown me what unconditional support looked like. As I walked into that courtroom, I was carrying the same thing she'd given me that night, and it was about to change everything. Drop a heart if you've ever felt completely abandoned by the people who were supposed to love you. Thomas Whitman stood with the calculated confidence of a man who'd never questioned his own version of events. His opening statement unfolded like a well-rehearsed play, each gesture timed for maximum impact on the audience that filled every available seat. Miss Monroe abandoned her family for a decade, only returning when money was involved, he began, his voice carrying the particular blend of sorrow and disappointment that juries found convincing. She left Mason Creek at 17, cutting all contact with the parents who raised her, and made no attempt to reconcile until she learned about her grandmother's substantial estate. I watched the faces in the gallery react to his words. Mrs. Chin from the post office frowned slightly. She'd been the one sorting my weekly letters to my grandmother for 10 years. But Mr. Dalton from the bank nodded along, probably remembering the version my parents had been telling at charity dinners and church gatherings. My mother sat perfectly still in the front row, her hands folded in her lap like a woman bearing up under tremendous emotional strain. She'd chosen her outfit carefully, navy dress, minimal jewelry, the kind of understated elegance that suggested dignity rather than wealth. Every few minutes, she'd touch a tissue to the corner of her eye, though I couldn't detect any actual moisture there. Your Honor, Whitman continued, Mrs. Carter was 87 years old when this will was executed. She'd been isolated from her loving daughter and son-in-law by their own child's bitter rejection of family values. In her loneliness and declining health, she became susceptible to manipulation from someone who knew exactly how to exploit an elderly woman's desire for reconciliation. My father maintained his expression of pained nobility. This was his courtroom persona. The respected attorney forced into an uncomfortable family situation, too honorable to speak ill of his own daughter, but too principled to stand by while justice was perverted. He'd probably practiced this look in the mirror. Judge Harrison listened without visible reaction, occasionally making notes on the legal pad in front of him. He'd been practicing law in Alabama for 35 years, long enough to recognize performance when he saw it, but protocol demanded he let both sides present their cases before forming opinions. Mrs. Monroe, Whitman said, gesturing toward my mother, would you tell the court about your relationship with your mother in her final years? My mother rose and walked to the witness stand with the measured pace of someone consciously demonstrating grace under pressure. She wore the expression I remembered from my teenage years, wounded but forgiving, disappointed but still loving. It was the same look she'd given me when I'd brought home a B instead of an A, when I'd chosen books over cheerleading, when I dared to want something she couldn't understand. My mother was a remarkable woman, she began, her voice catching slightly. Strong, independent, sometimes to a fault. But in her later years, especially after my father's death, she became vulnerable. She missed having family close by. The tissue appeared again, dabbing carefully so as not to disturb her makeup. We tried to maintain contact with Claire after she left home. We sent cards, called when we could reach her, invited her to family gatherings. But she'd made her choice to cut ties with us. When Mother started asking about her, we didn't want to hurt her by explaining that Claire wanted nothing to do with the family that raised her. I kept my expression neutral, but inside, I was cataloging the lies. The cards had stopped coming after my first semester of college. The invitations had never existed. The only family gatherings I'd missed were ones they'd never told me about. All we want, my mother continued, her voice strengthening with what sounded like renewed determination, is family reconciliation and forgiveness. This isn't about money, Your Honor. It's about healing the wounds that have divided our family for too long. She looked directly at me for the first time since entering the courtroom. Her eyes held the perfect mixture of hope and sadness, as if she believed this legal proceeding might actually bring us back together. As if 10 years of silence could be erased by a well-delivered speech about forgiveness. They were performing the same act that destroyed my childhood, the devoted parents baffled by their difficult daughter, the loving family torn apart by one person's selfish choices. It was a masterful performance, refined through years of practice on teachers, neighbors, and anyone else who might question why the Monroe family seemed to have such trouble with their only child. Behind them, I could see the gallery dividing along predictable lines. The country club crowd nodded sympathetically. They understood family disappointment, children who didn't appreciate their advantages. But the working families, the ones who'd interacted with my grandmother regularly, looked less convinced. They'd seen which granddaughter had visited the farmhouse, which one had sat beside the hospital bed, which one had arranged the funeral service. My father took the stand next, his testimony a variation on the same theme. Loving concern, family loyalty, elderly mother manipulated by opportunistic relative. He spoke about my grandmother's grief over our estrangement, the way she'd mentioned my name with increasing frequency in her final months. She just wanted her family whole again, he said, shaking his head sadly. Mother never understood why Claire felt she had to choose between independence and family. We certainly never asked her to make that choice. The courthouse clock ticked toward noon. The gallery shifted restlessly as Whitman moved through his evidence, medical records showing my grandmother's age, bank statements reflecting the estate's value, character witnesses who testified about my parents' standing in the community. But I noticed what the performance was missing. No one mentioned the Carter Foundation. No one talked about the scholarship recipients, the kids my grandmother had helped send to college. No one mentioned the community work, the mentorship, the 40-year legacy of using wealth to create opportunity. They'd reduced her entire life to a bank balance and a property deed. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't bring a lawyer's arrogance or a victim's plea. I brought the truth. And the first piece of evidence was going to shatter their perfect performance. Your Honor, I said, rising from my seat and reaching into my briefcase. I'd like to present evidence that directly contradicts the testimony we've just heard. My fingers closed around the weathered leather notebook that had been sitting on my grandmother's nightstand the day she died. Small, unassuming, the kind of journal someone might use for grocery lists or appointment reminders. But Judge Evelyn Carter had used it for something else entirely. This is my grandmother's private journal, I continued, walking toward the bench. She kept detailed records of family interactions, legal concerns, and personal observations for the last 3 years of her life. I could feel the shift in the room's energy. My mother's tissue had stopped moving. My father's practiced expression of patient dignity had frozen in place. Behind me, the gallery leaned forward as one, sensing that something important was about to happen. Objection, Whitman said quickly. Your Honor, this alleged journal hasn't been authenticated. We have no way of verifying. I'll allow it, Judge Harrison interrupted, his voice calm but firm. The witness may proceed. I opened the journal to a page I'd marked with a yellow sticky note, my hands steadier than they'd been all morning. My voice trembled, but my hands were steady. Grandma had prepared me for this moment. Entry dated March 15th of this year, I began. Richard and Elaine stopped by today to discuss Mother's future care needs. What they really wanted to discuss was selling the foundation's land to developers. Richard had papers with him, contracts from Meridian Properties offering above market value for the 47 acres. When I refused, he got that look in his eyes I remember from when Claire was little. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Meridian Properties was the development company that had been trying to buy farmland outside Mason Creek for the past 2 years, turning family properties into shopping centers and apartment complexes. I flipped to another marked page. April 22nd. Found documents in my mail that I never signed, transfer papers for the foundation's checking account, giving Richard and Elaine access as emergency contacts. My signature looked perfect, but I never wrote it. They've been forging my name. My mother's face had drained of all color. She was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not anger or disappointment, but something closer to genuine fear. May 8th, I continued, my voice gaining strength. Elaine came by with more papers today, insisting I needed to update my estate planning for tax purposes. She'd already filled in most of the information, just needed my signature. When I asked to review everything with my own attorney, she got upset and started crying about how I didn't trust my own family. I don't trust them. The only one I trust is Claire. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the court reporter had stopped typing to listen. I turned to the final entry I'd planned to read. June 3rd. Richard called this morning to say they'd heard I was having episodes and maybe needed help managing my affairs. I'm 87 years old, not senile. I know exactly what they're doing. They want the foundation money, and they want me declared incompetent so they can get it. I need to protect what we've built. I need to protect Claire. My father's chair scraped against the floor as he pushed back from the table. That's enough, he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. This is ridiculous. Anyone could have written. Mr. Monroe, Judge Harrison said sharply, you'll have your opportunity to respond. Please let the witness finish. I closed the journal and looked directly at my parents for the first time since entering the courtroom. There are 37 more entries documenting attempts at financial manipulation, emotional coercion, and systematic isolation. My grandmother wasn't a vulnerable elderly woman being manipulated by an estranged granddaughter. She was a retired judge who recognized a con when she saw one. The room exploded in whispers. I could hear fragments of conversation from the gallery, always wondered about those two, and explains why Claire stayed away, and Judge Carter was sharp as a tack till the day she died. My mother tried to stand, then sat back down heavily, as if her legs wouldn't support her. The carefully constructed mask of dignified grief had shattered completely, leaving behind something raw and desperate. Furthermore, I said, opening the journal one more time, she documented every attempt you made to keep me away from her. Every lie you told about my refusing to visit, every invitation you claimed to extend but never sent, every phone call you intercepted. My father slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a gunshot. This is fabricated evidence, he shouted, all pretense of courtroom decorum abandoned. That journal is fake, and anyone with half a brain can see. But the judge raised his hand, and that's when I saw something in his eyes that changed everything. The next twist had the whole courtroom in shock. Type justice if you can handle it, and comment if you've ever felt abandoned by the people who were supposed to love you. Silent watchers don't build this community, you do. Judge Harrison looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. His eyes had softened in a way that suggested recognition, but not the kind that comes from studying case files or reviewing evidence. This was something deeper, more personal. Miss Monroe, he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made the entire courtroom lean forward. I believe your grandmother always knew this day would come. The words hung in the air like a question mark. My mother's breathing had become shallow, almost visible. My father sat rigid in his chair, probably calculating how quickly he could request a different judge, claim conflict of interest, find some procedural escape from what was happening. Your Honor, I said, suddenly understanding what my grandmother had meant in her final conversation with me. She left something for you. I reached back into my briefcase, past the journal, past the legal documents I'd organized so carefully, to the sealed manila envelope that had been paper-clipped to the inside back cover of the journal. In my grandmother's careful handwriting, for Judge Michael Harrison, to be opened only in the presence of Claire Monroe. Judge Harrison stared at the envelope for a long moment before accepting it. His fingers traced the edges like he was handling something fragile and precious. 22 years ago, he said, speaking to the courtroom but looking at me, I was a third-year law student doing a judicial internship in this very courthouse. Judge Evelyn Carter taught me everything I know about the law, about justice, and about the difference between the two. He opened the envelope carefully, the paper rustling in the absolute silence. Inside was a single sheet of legal letterhead and what looked like several folded documents. She also taught me, he continued, unfolding the letter, that sometimes the law requires patience. Sometimes you have to wait for the right moment, the right evidence, the right case to make sure justice actually happens. My mother made a sound that was part gasp, part sob. She'd figured out what the rest of us were still processing. This wasn't a random assignment. Judge Harrison hadn't been selected for this case by chance. Miss Monroe, Judge Harrison said, holding up the letter so I could see my grandmother's handwriting, your grandmother filed a legal amendment to her will 6 months before her death. This amendment, witnessed and notarized according to Alabama state law, explicitly confirms you as the sole beneficiary of her estate and names you as the permanent, irrevocable trustee of the Carter Foundation. The courtroom erupted in whispers. I could hear fragments of conversation. She planned this whole thing, and always was 10 steps ahead, and those poor Monroe kids never knew what hit them. But Judge Harrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, this amendment includes a detailed legal finding, based on Judge Carter's own investigation, that Richard and Elaine Monroe had been systematically attempting to defraud her estate through forged documents, emotional manipulation, and financial coercion. My father's face had gone from anger to something approaching panic. He was leaning toward Whitman, whispering urgently, probably demanding to know how this was possible, how they'd missed something this significant in their preparation. Your grandmother, Judge Harrison continued, looking directly at me now, also included a personal note explaining that she'd been in contact with my office for months, providing documentation of your parents' behavior and requesting that I oversee any legal proceedings involving her estate. He wasn't just any judge, he was Grandma's chosen successor in the fight for justice. The sealed documents turned out to be copies of everything my parents thought they'd hidden. Bank records showing the forged signatures. Email exchanges with Meridian Properties about selling the foundation's land. Even recordings, my grandmother had been documenting their visits, their phone calls, their increasingly desperate attempts to gain access to her money. She knew, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. She knew they'd challenge the will. She knew a lot of things, Judge Harrison replied, including the fact that you'd spent 10 years visiting her every month, helping with foundation business and learning everything she could teach you about running a charitable organization. She also knew your parents had spent those same 10 years avoiding her unless they needed something. The gallery had become a sea of nodding heads. Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop was crying openly. Mr. Chan from the hardware store was shaking his head in obvious disgust. These were people who'd watched my grandmother's final years unfold, who'd seen which family members showed up and which ones stayed away. My mother finally found her voice. "This is impossible," she said, her carefully modulated tone cracking. "Mother wouldn't have. She loved us. We're her family." "Mrs. Monroe," Judge Harrison said, his voice gentle but firm, "your mother loved you enough to document your behavior rather than simply cutting you off entirely. She gave you multiple opportunities to change course, to stop treating her as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected." He held up one of the recordings. "Would you like me to play the conversation from April where you told her she was getting confused and needed to let people who understand money handle her affairs? Or perhaps the one from May where your husband suggested she might be happier in an assisted living facility?" The courtroom erupted in whispers. My parents looked as if the floor had given way beneath them. But I wasn't done. The second revelation was going to destroy them completely. I reached into my briefcase one more time, my fingers finding the thick manila folder I'd saved for last. The weight of it felt significant in my hands, 32 pages of legal documents that would reshape everything my parents thought they understood about their own lives. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my chest, "there's one more piece of evidence the court needs to see." Judge Harrison nodded, his expression suggesting he was prepared for whatever came next. Behind me, I could hear my father whispering urgently to Whitman, probably demanding to know how many more surprises they'd have to endure. "This is a transfer of ownership deed," I said, holding up the first document so the gallery could see the official seal. "Dated November 15th, 2 years ago. The property in question is 412 Magnolia Street, the house my parents have been living in for the past 18 years. My mother's hands had gone completely still. The tissue she'd been clutching dropped to the floor. According to this deed, my grandmother purchased the property from First National Bank of Mason Creek after the previous owners defaulted on their mortgage payments. The purchase price was $147,000, paid in full on the date of transfer." The silence in the courtroom was so complete I could hear the fluorescent lights humming overhead. I looked directly at my parents for the first time since the revelations began. The previous owners, I continued, were Richard and Elaine Monroe. My mother's jaw fell open, a sound escaping that was part gasp, part strangled cry. My father's face had gone from red to pale in the span of seconds, his hands gripping the edge of the table like he was trying to anchor himself to something solid. "For 2 years," I said, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the courtroom, "you've been living in my grandmother's house. The mortgage you thought you were paying? Rent. The property taxes she helped with? Landlord expenses. The home you've been using as collateral for credit lines and equity loans? It was never yours." Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop made a small O of surprise. Mr. Chin was shaking his head slowly, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. These were people who'd seen my parents at church fundraisers and charity dinners, talking about their beautiful home and successful investments. Furthermore, I continued, pulling out a stack of bank statements, "These records show my grandmother had been covering your mortgage payments for 8 months before she bought the house outright. You were 3 payments away from foreclosure when she intervened." The transformation happening in front of me was almost physical. My father, who'd walked into this courtroom as a respected attorney with friends in high places, now looked like a man watching his entire world collapse. My mother, who'd spent the morning playing the role of dignified daughter, was staring at me with naked shock. "She never told you she'd bought it," I said, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, I felt a flicker of sadness for them. "She let you believe you were still homeowners because she didn't want to humiliate you in front of the community." Whitman was frantically shuffling through his papers, looking for anything, that might contradict what I was saying. But my grandmother had been a judge for 40 years. Her documentation was flawless. "Your Honor," I said, turning back to Judge Harrison, "my grandmother's estate includes not only the farmhouse and foundation assets, but also the property at 412 Magnolia Street, currently occupied by Richard and Elaine Monroe under a verbal tenancy agreement that terminated upon my grandmother's death." The legal implications were clear to everyone in the room. My parents weren't just losing their claim to an inheritance they'd never deserved. They were losing their home. "This can't be right," my mother said, her voice breaking for the first time all day. But this wasn't the calculated emotion she'd displayed earlier. This was raw panic. "We have equity in that house. We've put money into maintenance. Improvements to someone else's property," Judge Harrison said quietly. "Unless you have documentation showing the owner's consent for major modifications, tenant improvements typically belong to the landlord." My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane," he said, his voice loud enough to echo off the courthouse walls. "You're telling me my mother-in-law bought our house out from under us and never said a word?" "She bought your house to save it from foreclosure," I corrected. "And she never said a word because she hoped you'd eventually figure out how to be a real family instead of people who only showed up when they needed money." The gallery had become a chorus of whispers and murmurs. I could see people putting together timelines, remembering conversations, understanding why my grandmother had always seemed sad after my parents' visits. Judge Harrison consulted the documents in front of him, making notes with the careful precision of someone who understood the weight of what was happening. "Miss Monroe," he said finally, as the inheritor of Judge Carter's estate, "you are now the legal owner of the property at 412 Magnolia Street. Do you wish to continue the tenancy arrangement with the current occupants?" The question hung in the air like a test. I looked at my parents, really looked at them, for what felt like the first time in years. They were smaller than I remembered, older, less formidable. The people who'd seemed so powerful when I was 17 looked tired and defeated. "They have 30 days to make other arrangements," I said. My mother's heels clicked furiously as they left the courtroom. But as those doors closed, I realized this victory came with a price I wasn't prepared for. Have you ever seen karma work this perfectly? Let me know your thoughts, because the emotional ending is coming. Judge Harrison's gavel came down with the finality of a door closing. "This court finds in favor of the defendant," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years on the bench. "The will of Judge Evelyn Carter is upheld in its entirety. Miss Claire Monroe is confirmed as the sole beneficiary of the estate, including all properties, assets, and responsibilities associated with the Carter Foundation." The words should have felt like victory. Complete vindication, legal recognition, everything my grandmother had wanted me to have. But sitting in that courtroom, watching my parents gather their papers with the mechanical movements of people in shock, I felt something closer to emptiness. My father stood first, his movements stiff and deliberate. He didn't look at me as he collected his briefcase, didn't acknowledge Judge Harrison's closing remarks, didn't even glance toward Whitman, who was still staring at the documents that had destroyed his case. Richard Monroe, who'd spent his entire career crafting arguments and controlling narratives, had been reduced to silence. My mother took longer to rise. Her hands shook as she reached for her purse, and for a moment I thought she might say something, an apology, an explanation, even a final accusation. Instead, she smoothed her navy dress with the same careful precision she'd maintained all morning, as if proper appearance could somehow restore what had been lost. They walked toward the courtroom doors with the measured pace of people who understood they were being watched. My mother's heels clicked against the tile in a rhythm that seemed too loud for the space, each step echoing off the walls like a countdown. My father held the door for her, a gesture of courtesy that looked automatic, practiced, empty of any real consideration. They didn't look back. The gallery began to empty slowly, people filing out in small groups, their conversations a mixture of satisfaction and sympathy. Mrs. Patterson squeezed my shoulder as she passed. Mr. Chin nodded approvingly. The postmaster, who'd been sorting my letters to my grandmother for a decade, gave me a small smile that felt like vindication. But as the courtroom emptied, the silence that remained felt heavier than the whispers that had filled it all morning. "Miss Monroe," Judge Harrison said quietly, "would you approach the bench?" I walked forward on unsteady legs, my briefcase feeling lighter now that it had surrendered all its secrets. Judge Harrison looked at me with the same expression I remembered from my grandmother's face during our Sunday dinners, understanding mixed with concern, wisdom tempered by kindness. "Your grandmother was proud of you, Claire," he said, his voice soft enough that only I could hear. "She wanted you to finish what she started, to clean the Monroe name." "Did she know it would feel like this?" I asked, the question escaping before I could stop it. He considered the question for a long moment, looking down at the legal documents that had just reshaped my entire life. "She knew that justice and satisfaction aren't always the same thing," he said finally. "She also knew that sometimes protecting what matters requires difficult choices." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I understood. Justice brings closure, but it can't resurrect love that was never real. "The foundation will need attention," Judge Harrison continued. 3 scholarship applications are pending review, and the annual fundraiser is next month. Your grandmother built something important here, something that outlasts family drama and legal disputes. "I know," I said. "I've been helping with the applications for 2 years." His expression softened further. "Of course you have. She mentioned that in our conversations. Said you understood the work better than anyone else ever had." The courtroom was empty now except for the 2 of us. Afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the wooden pews where my parents had sat that morning. It was hard to believe the day had started with their confident smiles and whispered mockery. "Why do you think she didn't just cut them off completely?" I asked. She could have changed her will years ago, removed any possibility of them challenging it. Why did she leave me to face this alone? Judge Harrison gathered his papers slowly, giving the question the consideration it deserved. "I don't think she left you alone," he said finally. "I think she knew you were strong enough to handle what needed to be handled. And I think she wanted you to understand exactly who they were before you made decisions about who you wanted to be." He stood, his robes rustling in the quiet space. "Your grandmother spent 40 years on this bench, Claire. She understood that the most important lessons can't be taught, they have to be experienced." I watched him leave, his footsteps echoing down the hallway until the courthouse fell completely silent. Then I sat alone in the front row, in the same spot where my parents had performed their morning charade, trying to process what I'd won and what I'd lost. The inheritance was mine. The foundation, the farmhouse, even the house I'd grown up in, all legally, unquestionably mine. I had enough money to fund scholarships for decades, to expand the foundation's reach, to build something meaningful from the wreckage of family dysfunction. But the people who'd raised me, however badly, were gone. Not dead, but gone in a way that felt permanent. I'd exposed their lies, revealed their greed, humiliated them in front of the community they'd spent decades trying to impress. I'd won everything and lost the last possibility of ever having a real family. That night, when I returned to her farmhouse, I found something that made me question everything I thought I knew about my family. What I found in my grandmother's desk that night changed everything I thought I knew about my entire life. But most people aren't ready for this level of family secrets. Are you? Hit subscribe if you can handle the truth. The farmhouse felt different without the weight of impending legal battle pressing down on everything. I'd driven the 23 minutes from the courthouse to my grandmother's property. My property now, in complete silence, the radio off, my phone turned face down on the passenger seat. The front porch still held her rocking chair, positioned to catch the afternoon sun that filtered through the oak trees she'd planted 40 years ago. The yellow roses she'd tended every morning were beginning their second bloom of the season, their petals scattered across the wooden steps by an evening breeze that carried the scent of approaching rain. Inside, everything remained exactly as she'd left it. The kitchen table still held her reading glasses and the crossword puzzle she'd been working on the morning she died. The living room maintained the precise arrangement of furniture she'd preferred, couch angled toward the fireplace, side table positioned for easy reach, stack of legal journals beside her favorite chair. But it was her study that drew me, the small room at the back of the house where she'd handled foundation business and kept the records that had shaped my inheritance case. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light across surfaces that held 40 years of careful organization. Law books arranged by subject, filing cabinets labeled in her neat handwriting, photographs positioned with the deliberate care of someone who understood that objects could carry memory. I sank into her leather chair, feeling the weight of the day settle into my bones like sediment. Complete victory. Total vindication, everything I'd hoped for when I'd walked into that courthouse 12 hours ago. So why did it feel like something was missing? The photograph on the corner of her desk caught my attention, not because I'd never seen it before, but because it seemed positioned differently than I remembered. Judge Evelyn Carter in her black robes, taken during her swearing-in ceremony 38 years ago. She looked young in the picture, younger than I was now, her expression serious but hopeful. I picked up the frame to adjust its position and felt something shift underneath. A manila envelope, letter-sized, tucked beneath the photograph's base like it had been deliberately hidden. My name was written across the front in my grandmother's careful script, for Claire Monroe, to be opened after the inheritance matter is resolved. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, her personal stationery, the kind she used for important correspondence. The letter was dated 3 days before her death. My dear Claire, it began, if you're reading this, it means you've won the legal battle and learned the truth about your parents' attempts to steal from the foundation. I'm proud of you for standing up to them, but there's something else you need to know. Something I should have told you years ago, but I was trying to protect you from a truth that might have been too much to bear. I paused, my heart rate accelerating in a way that felt disconnected from the quiet farmhouse around me. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting longer shadows across the study, making the preserved space feel more like a museum than a home. Your parents aren't who you think they are. 5 words that seemed to rewrite everything I'd believed about my life, my family, the people who'd raised me. I read the sentence again, then again, as if repetition might change its meaning or reveal some context I'd missed. Richard Monroe is not your biological father. Elaine Monroe is not your biological mother. They adopted you when you were 6 months old, and they've spent your entire life hiding that fact from you and from me. The letter slipped from my fingers, floating to the desk like a leaf falling from a dead tree. I stared at it, my mind struggling to process information that seemed to contradict everything I thought I knew about my own existence. Adopted. The word echoed in my head like a question mark. The parents who'd rejected me, abandoned me, manipulated me for money, they weren't even related to me by blood. The woman whose inheritance I'd fought for all day wasn't technically my grandmother. But then why had she loved me? Why had she chosen me over them? I picked up the letter with trembling hands and continued reading. I learned the truth 6 months ago when Richard let something slip during one of his visits. He was talking about family genetics, making jokes about how you'd inherited none of their practical sense. When I pressed him, thinking he was just being cruel, he told me the whole story. You were placed with them through a private adoption arranged by their lawyer friend in Montgomery. Your birth parents were teenagers who couldn't care for you. The room seemed to be shifting around me, familiar objects taking on new significance. The photographs on the walls, did I look like anyone in them? The family stories I'd grown up with, were any of them actually mine? What broke my heart, the letter continued, was realizing they'd used your adoption as a weapon against you. Every time they told you that you didn't belong, that you were different from the family, that you were ungrateful for everything they'd given you, they knew exactly why those words cut so deep. They raised you to feel like an outsider in your own home because, in their minds, you were. I thought about all the arguments, all the ways they'd made me feel like I was failing to live up to some family standard I could never understand. The comments about my interests being strange, my choices being uncharacteristic, my very existence being somehow disappointing. It had never been about my behavior. It had been about my origins. But here's what they never understood, my grandmother's letter concluded. Family isn't about blood or legal documents. It's about choice. I chose you, Claire, not because you were my biological granddaughter, but because you showed me who you really were. You are exactly the person I hoped you would become. The paper was blotched now with tears I didn't remember starting to cry. Everything I'd fought for in that courtroom, the inheritance, the foundation, the house, belonged to me not because of family obligation, but because someone had chosen to love me despite having no biological reason to do so. And just like that, the story wasn't over. It was only beginning. Because what I discovered next would change how I saw my entire life. Type what if you need to know what that letter really said. The truth is darker than you think. 3 months after the trial, I was sitting in my grandmother's study, my study now, reviewing scholarship applications when Maria Santos knocked on the farmhouse door. 18 years old, valedictorian of Mason Creek High, first in her family to graduate and dreaming of becoming a nurse practitioner despite having exactly $73 in her college fund. "Miss Monroe," she said when I opened the door, her voice carrying the particular mixture of hope and terror that came with asking for help. "Mrs. Patterson at the flower shop said you might be able to help with college funding?" I invited her in, watching her take in the farmhouse with the wide eyes of someone who'd probably never been inside a home with more than 3 rooms. We sat at the kitchen table where my grandmother had made Sunday dinners for 10 years, where she'd taught me that listening was more important than talking, that presence mattered more than promises. "Tell me about your plans," I said, pouring sweet tea into glasses that had belonged to my great-grandmother. Maria's dreams unfolded like a roadmap. Nursing school at Auburn, specialization in rural healthcare, plans to return to Mason Creek and serve the communities that had raised her. She had the grades, the determination, and the kind of quiet strength I recognized from looking in mirrors. The Carter Foundation covers full tuition, books, and living expenses for students committed to community service, I told her, watching her face transform from cautious optimism to pure joy. "You'll need to maintain a 3.5 GPA and complete 20 hours of community service each semester, but I don't think that'll be a problem." She cried then, tears of relief and gratitude that reminded me why my grandmother had started this foundation 40 years ago. Not for tax benefits or community recognition, but for moments like this, when hard work and potential met opportunity and created possibilities that hadn't existed before. Maria was the 7th scholarship recipient I'd approved since taking over the foundation. 7 kids whose stories reminded me that family could be built through shared purpose, that love could be expressed through creating opportunities for others to succeed. The foundation's work had expanded under my leadership. We'd added emergency grants for families facing medical crises, partnered with the local community college to offer trade school scholarships, and established a mentorship program that paired scholarship recipients with local business owners. The inheritance that had seemed like such a battleground 3 months ago had become a tool for building something larger than family drama. But late at night, when the scholarship files were reviewed and the grant applications were processed, I found myself returning to the letter that had changed everything I thought I knew about my identity. The questions it raised had been growing louder each week, demanding attention I wasn't sure I was ready to give. Who were my biological parents? Why had Richard and Elaine Monroe been chosen to adopt me? And most importantly, why had they hidden the truth for 27 years? I'd started my own investigation quietly, reaching out to adoption agencies in Montgomery, requesting records from the time frame my grandmother had mentioned, trying to piece together a history that had been deliberately obscured. What I discovered so far raised more questions than it answered. The adoption hadn't been arranged through the state system. It had been private, handled by a lawyer who died 15 years ago, his records sealed and his practice dissolved. The Monroe family had paid significant fees, more than most adoptions cost, enough to suggest either urgency or special circumstances. And there were gaps in the timeline, missing documents, paperwork that should have existed but didn't. Most troubling of all, I'd found evidence that someone had been trying to erase the paper trail long before I'd started looking. Records had been destroyed, files had been lost, people who should have remembered the adoption claimed no knowledge of it. My grandmother always said that showing up matters more than sharing DNA. She showed up for me when no one else would. Now it's my turn to show up for others. But first, I need to find out who my parents really are and why someone wanted me to think they were my enemies. The Carter Foundation had given me purpose, community, and a way to honor the woman who'd chosen to love me despite having no obligation to do so. But the unanswered questions about my origins had become impossible to ignore. Somewhere out there, my real story was waiting to be discovered. And based on how hard someone had worked to hide it, I was starting to suspect that story was darker than anything I'd uncovered in that courtroom. This story taught me one thing: family isn't about blood. It's about who stands by you when everyone else walks away. If this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe, because the investigation into my parents' real identity begins next week. Tell me in the comments, have you ever uncovered something that completely changed what you believed about your past?